Welcome to Messy Liberation,
This is our special Everything is Political series.
where we're going to help you draw the connections between your everyday life and the world around you.
Let's get started.
Today, we're joined by Shauna Manai Spence. You're a registered dietitian and nutritionist who calls yourself an all foods fit dietitian. I came to know of you as probably through lots of people because you have a really popular Instagram and Threads, which is where I hang out, account called the Nutrition Tea, TEA, where you kind of spill the tea on nutrition. And I freaking adore the way you show up and you get in people's comments and all the things to defend the fact or to just show up as the voice of like diet culture is a bunch of shit and here's why. And we need more of that, especially coming from dietitians and nutritionists and the people in your world where sometimes the harmful messaging can proliferate. So I'm excited to have you here to talk about this. Is there anything else you wanted to mention about yourself? I should have mentioned your book too, because you also have a book called Live Nourished, Make Peace with Food, Banish Body Shame, and Reclaim Joy that came out 2 years ago. All about these sorts of things. Thanks for being here, Shauna. Anything else that I missed on your intro?
No, thank you. It's so funny. I'm all in people's comments. Like, yes, I am. It's so funny because I find myself very chatty online, but of course in person, I'm such an introvert. But yes, I do love being online and just, clearing things up for some people. And, I'm based in New York and I work in public health, but I also do a bunch of media stuff and online presence as well. So I wear many hats. Yes.
I like your being in the comments and also relate because I'm also an introvert, but it's easier to be a little fearless online. Unfortunately,
No, exactly.
trolls.
Exactly. In a good, positive way, not in
Yeah.
like a
When you're doing
trolling
it when you're doing it for good, I think it's great. Well, we're gonna start this the way we do with everything, and you're here to talk to us sort of about food, diet culture, all of that. So when did you start to recognize in your journey that food is political?
Oh goodness. It took a while actually. I mean, I think I've always had an idea, when I was becoming a dietitian. We had to take like a community health class and community nutrition class, and that's where we sort of started learning about people having to, needing access to food and not having access to food. And I think that that's what sort of sparked my interest, but I work in public health currently. I work for the Department of Health here in New York City, and my job is to go out into the fields. I work in schools in predominantly low-income areas. And so I'm sort of seeing firsthand that, yes, our policies, our politicians who make these policies or unfortunately don't try to change some policies, it affects how people eat. It affects how folks access food. It also affects, I mean, everything's political, but, it affects like redlining, what stores are in the areas. It's sort of a shock, I think, hear this, but here, especially in cities, you think of an abundance of stores, especially in New York. And I always tell people there's some areas in New York City, right? Not upstate, not in the suburbs, in New York City that are food deserts because they don't have grocery stores. People have to really travel to grocery stores. And that's going to affect how some people access food. So I think that that's why I kind of talk about the things I talk about because I'm sort of witnessing it firsthand. And I think that sometimes, well, especially now with our political climate and the people in charge currently, it definitely has, I think that I definitely have to keep talking about this because it's so incredibly important.
Yeah.
But yeah.
What I've seen that, or I've heard that phrase food desert, and, right now I live in Baltimore, and before this I lived in Atlanta, and there are definitely parts in both cities where it's like there's no quick access to like a grocery store or a market. How far does someone have to travel before it's considered a food desert? Like,
It is when someone has to travel at least like 10 miles to access food, it's considered a food desert. Yeah.
And then and in places where people walk, that is no small
Exactly.
feat.
yeah,
That's pretty far. So, and that's for rural, right? That's for places where you have a car. But for, like you said, for walking, for cities, it's actually 1 mile. And so,
wow.
Yeah, and so a lot of times you're walking, and there are places where I was, doing my nutrition lessons and, development and policies into the schools. And I'm walking around the neighborhood and I'm thinking to myself, I have not seen a grocery store. Okay.
Mhm,
And we're talking about places, this is New York City. So like in Manhattan, in Queens, I've been walking really far and I'm thinking, I have not seen a place to access food unless we're talking about like a corner store or a bodega, which, yes, we're glad that they sell like the canned foods and, the things that they do for sure. But when we're talking about getting that variety of food that really nourishes us, it's very hard. It's very hard in
mhm.
many places. So, yeah, so those are the actual parameters 1 mile for if you live in an urban slash city, and 10 miles for rural places.
Wow.
Yeah. And that doesn't get at the ableist part of that many people can't walk a
Yeah,
mile,
Exactly.
whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah. So it
remember.
really limits people's access to nutrient dense food.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Mhm. Yeah, I remember growing up in New York, not in the city, but in Yonkers, and my grandmother having to walk to the grocery store because Yonkers is like South Westchester, so it's technically upstate, but it's still very urban, and she couldn't drive. No one in the family really had a car either, and so she had her little cart that she would walk, like, up the hills to the grocery store and then walk back with all that stuff, like, carrying it, and
Mhm.
someone always had to go with her too because she hardly spoke English and she
Yeah.
couldn't read or write. So again, this question of access, right? And she was a senior citizen, right? Like
Mhm.
she was older with her own health condition. And so this question of like, even if it is within a mile, like how accessible is it? Like, is there public transportation, right? Like, do people have access to the social support that they need to get the nutrition that they need, right? Like the fresh food, right? And so we obviously had bodegas. One
Mhm.
of our close family friends had a bodega like a couple blocks from where she lived, and there was like some fresh food there, but it was mostly like prepackaged, pre-processed kind of food, which is good in a pinch, right? Like obviously that has its
Mhm.
place, but if you're talking about fresh food, that's a little bit of a different story, and the variety as well.
Exactly. Yeah, because we need a variety of nutrients. And one thing that I also always talk about is I call it convenience foods, like the canned foods, and they serve a purpose. Like I have a bunch of canned beans in my pantry right now because I personally just don't want to spend time soaking beans. I mean, I can, but I don't want to. So, yes, so that's what I mean by convenience foods. And it's technically canned food and frozen foods, right? Like frozen vegetables. So those I call like convenience foods.
Hmm.
And of course, they serve a purpose, but our bodies need a variety of foods. And quite frankly, the inaccessibility in some areas make that very challenging. And
Hmm.
you mentioned disabilities, it's ableist for sure. I 100% think of people, older adults, people with disabilities who have mobility issues. It's very difficult to get around. Sure, there are some programs that deliver food, but not even everyone knows about those programs or has access to apply to those programs because you need the internet, you need the computer. So all
Hmm.
of these things, go hand in hand. So it's very difficult.
There's so
Yeah.
many barriers to eating in a way that nourishes your body for many
Mhm.
people. Yet there are many people for whom those barriers don't exist and they don't necessarily understand those. Another one that I
Exactly.
think about too is obviously there's the financial piece, right? Can you
Mhm.
afford to buy health nutritious? I'm trying to change my language as much as I can too around like judgment words around food, which we can get into. But can you
Yeah.
afford to buy nutritious, nutrient dense kind of food?
Mhm.
Especially when the government's, trying and succeeding in many cases of taking away a lot of these benefits that help
Yeah.
families, SNAP benefits, other benefits that help people being able to get food onto their plates. And then there's also the issue around like who can grow food and who can't, right? When you don't have land, you don't have space, maybe also no knowledge, because where do we learn this? Often, like the idea of being able to plant and grow your own food is something you have to learn from someone, and that's often passed down. And if that's not something that's come to you, and you don't and or don't have space for that, and or don't have money for that, because it's also a very expensive endeavor to
Yeah.
grow your own food, which people don't always realize. So like there are all these barriers to access for food
Mhm.
that I think are really important to talk about. And the piece that I think is that you often do such a great job of is for those people who don't have those barriers, who don't understand that for a large percentage of population, there are very real barriers to getting food that can keep their bodies as healthy as they would like their bodies to be, as everyone would like their bodies to be. What do you see happen on the other side of that? Like, what does that lead to as far as shame, personal accountability, and that kind of thing? The individualization of
Yeah.
food choices.
For sure. There's definitely a feeling of shame, in how people eat, how they access food, what foods they're able to put into their bodies. And you can even see it online, and not to not to base everything on social media, but sometimes you look at the questions people ask or someone posts and they're just like, one was very recently where she kind of felt ashamed. I'm not sure what ethnicity, but she was talking about like mostly Hispanic, Latino, Latinx foods, rice and beans, right? So Frito. And she was saying, I love these foods, but do I have to give them up because they're not clean, quote unquote clean. And, so people already have this stigma in their heads about what's considered quote unquote healthy or, and
Mhm.
what's not. And that's coming from a very, of course, westernized, you know, white supremacy kind of area, right? Of focus, which I'm sure we'll get into. Even when I'm out in certain communities and people come up to me one on one, when I'm at my centers, I'm at my place of business, people will always ask questions. Well, do I have to give up this? Do I have to give up that? Or they'll start with, I know it's unhealthy, but I love X, Y, and Z.
Mm.
And I always say, well, who said that it's unhealthy? And I kind of ask them, I say, what do you mean it's unhealthy? Do you have an allergy to it? Because then definitely don't eat it, or, why do you feel like it's unhealthy? And it's, well, I read about this or someone said this. And so we really kind of have to, and that's the reason why I speak about certain topics the way that I do, because I think that we're just oversaturated right now with information and where that information is coming from. I don't want to say, I try to believe everyone has good intentions. Like, I don't want to call everybody problematic, but it's just oftentimes misinformed. I'll say that
Yeah. Yeah.
misinformed.
Yeah.
Because I do believe a lot of people do have good intentions, but it's hard because unless you actually went to school and read studies and know how to interpret studies, everything sounds scary.
Yeah.
Everything, our food system sounds very scary. But I spent a lot of time, not saying that I'm the smartest person out there, but I spent a lot of
This is
time
your
in
work.
school. Exactly. I
Yeah.
spent a lot of time, going to school and learning how to read studies. So how I interpret things is going to be very different from someone who is just looking at, something posted on CNN,
Yeah. Some
with
random graph. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So I like to really dig deeper and always ask people, well, where are you getting this information that it's something is unhealthy? Why is it unhealthy to you? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so easy to take data and manipulate it. And I
For
think that's something that
sure.
a lot of people don't understand. Like it's first of all, it's easy to manipulate how to get the data,
Mhm.
right? How you ask the questions to get the data that you want. It's so easy to do that. And then once you have the data, whether or not you've manipulated the outcome, like it's easy to just manipulate what it looks like, right? To use language and to use specific kinds of like charts and graphs to make it look one way without actually contextualizing what the information that you're sharing. So my wife is a data scientist. Well,
Mhm.
it's like her biggest pet peeve all the time. Like, okay, well, like who's asking the real questions here? Like, where is this coming from? And so it's a conversation we always have in our home. How do you like incorporate some of that work with like I know you talked about like, asking clients like, where did you hear that? Like, where did you learn
Mhm.
that? Where did that come from? But like, how how else does it show up in terms of like helping clients understand like all the intersections that are involved in how we think about food and what we put in our bodies and how we think about health, right? And nutrition.
Mhm. Yeah, I think just really whenever I see certain topics come up, I sort of try to either write about it in long form, like, in Substack, or just making a post about it. I try my best. I mean, you're not going to please everybody. There are a lot of people in this world, but I try my best to post about things on social media that maybe I see keep coming up repetitively as far as, some things are misinformed or guided. And I'll try to talk that way as well. Whenever I'm in the schools and, I'll give you an example, right? Like seed oils is always a huge topic of concern for many people. And those are also studies that have been misinterpreted. First of all, many studies when it comes to nutrition are done in rats, right? And I always say we need to base our interpretation on humans, on how it affects humans, because we do not have the same bodies as rats, okay? And so a lot of times, people will just look at the conclusion of a study or they'll see, well, it's associated with something, toxic. And, seed oils now, I'm shocked that it keeps coming up. This has been debunked. It's actually showing that they're good for our health. And people like to compare our food system to, I don't know, Europe is like the standard of food systems for some reason, which is kind of funny, but they use seed oils in everything. And they do this because seed oils actually are heart health promoting. And so I remember once, this was actually last year, I was at a conference in the Netherlands, and I was on a panel, and one of the fellow panelists, she was like, well, why are Americans, she was from Belgium, and she said, why are Americans so scared of seed oils? I said, because a lot of times the data that we're getting is misinterpreted. So, I see constant questions like that come up. And so I'll try to respond in a way that's sort of neutral, that's not shaming somebody for asking, because people have a right to want to know what's in their food. But I do find myself posting about things in order to get out to the general public
Mhm.
or writing about it. Or if someone one on one has a question, after I'm doing my lessons, I'll speak on that. But that's really how I like to get the word out there.
And, because you're talking, I liked how you mentioned sort of the difference between like food and
Mhm.
nutrition and
Yeah.
like health, and also where diet stuff fits in there. Like, and there's diet, meaning the foods we eat, and then diet as in restriction.
Yes.
But I'm your industry and your experience in that, it feels like things have gotten a lot better.
Mhm.
And it does seem like dietitians and nutritionists have contributed, and so have all sorts of other people who lack education. So, but even within the industry of people who maybe should have known better, or one would think maybe would be better educated, but weren't because of white supremacy and all the reasons, who've
Mhm.
helped to contribute to some of these beliefs about body size and shape and these sorts of things, and the way that the line between that and what is considered healthy. And I do think like I see so much improvement happening. And now we're entering this wild, wild new frontier of GLP-1s. And again,
Mm.
all of the caveats around like there are many people for whom they are life-saving, they are needed, and we're grateful for medicine where it's helpful. And yet it's also contributing to kind of taking us back in some ways to when I feel like some of this was at its peak worst around these links between what you put in your mouth and then like whether you're healthy or not. What you put in your mouth, what your body ends up looking like in theory because of that, and then whether you're healthy. So I'm just wondering, like, if you could reflect a little bit on what you've seen about the industry that you're in and how it's contributed, how it's changed, and if you have any worries about things moving forward.
Oh, for sure. I think we're always evolving. We are science-based industry with food, nutrition, it's always going to be evolving. And I think that unlike what you're reading about mostly in the media with clickbait titles, our food supply is now safer than ever. And, it's unfortunate that it's shown to be otherwise, you know? I mean, we've gotten to a place, I think everyone's learned this. I remember learning about this in high school, like our food system, how it used to be it was like a free for all, right? When they were producing milk, it wasn't really milk. They'd like put like chalk or something in there to make it more white. Like things like that they used to do. And look at how far we've come now, with regulating certain things. And
And
so
drinking raw milk.
I know, well, and then we take 2 steps back.
Mhm. Yeah.
So it's like we're moving forward and then we're kind of going backwards. But I think that, it's really important. That's why I try to talk as much as I do about our food system and, because it's always going to change. And I think we should also keep up with the change as well. And that goes with body image. Like you said, it's now with the GLP-1s. Yes, it's needed because we have to remember that it's also medication for diabetes, right? People need that. It's life-saving for people with diabetes. However, it's gotten to a point now where we have someone like, and this is no shade to any particular celebrity. Since she's out there, I'm just using her name, but like someone like Serena Williams, right? Who is now the face of Roe, which is a type of medication. We're seeing celebrities who she's like one of the greatest athletes of our generation, of our time. And, now she's using something because of body image, that we're now seeing a thinner is in. So now we have someone like Serena Williams advertising this. There's Oprah is always going to be the face, unfortunately, of, weight loss industry, no matter what it is. So we're seeing all of these celebrities now talking about, having all this access to GLP-1s and people getting access to GLP-1s to lose weight. Is it really, and I really wish people would question, is it for actual health reasons or is it more for vanity? Because I always use the quote, are you in pursuit of thinness or are you actually in pursuit of health? Because most of the time we're just in pursuit of thinness. We're just in pursuit of an aesthetic. And, I see this all the time when people are talking about food. Well, it's healthy to only eat 1,200 calories a day. It's not actually, because our organs require 1,300 calories to function. So again, what exactly is health promoting about what you're advertising? So I always ask people to really think, about what they're saying and what they're putting out there. Because especially with the GLP-1 usage, I mean, we see celebrities on the red carpet, and I try not to, I don't try to make assumptions right away because I just remember celebrities like who actually had health problems, right? We see them shrinking and then we find out they have had health problems. So that's why I'm very, very hesitant to just lash on to, people's appearance.
Mhm.
However, when you're actually advertising yourself using something to lose weight and it's getting to a point where it might be concerning, that's when we kind of have to really say, hey, maybe we should rethink this. So it's a little, it's there's never a dull moment, I will say, in my industry, because now we're battling so much. And I know dietitians who work for hospitals or their own private practice, even if they're like myself, who are weight inclusive, who don't push weight loss, they have clients on GLP-1s who are malnourished because GLP-1s, they take away that hunger.
Yeah.
So you're always feeling that satiety and you're not hungry. So they're not nourishing themselves properly because of that. So now we're looking at malnourishment. So it's just this ever evolving cycle when it comes to food and nutrition for many different reasons. And, unfortunately, I don't want to say GLP-1s aren't necessarily bad because, again, like I said before, people with diabetes need them. But, it's concerning now that there's more access available to people who want them. I'll just say that. Not
Yeah.
need, the want.
Yeah. Yeah. They seem to have, like, kind of exploded in the past, like, year. Like, I
Totally.
remember when it was just like Manjaro or I forgot which one it was, but it was just like one, and now they're everywhere, and now all the independent like health apps
Mhm.
and health startups are offering them too. And then I saw an ad for like a GLP-1 pill now,
Yes.
where it's like not an injection, and so it's like it's becoming this. It's like really, it's moved from the exception to the rule, right? And
100%.
so
And it's moved
I
from the medical arena, although the medical arena was also corporatized, but it's moved from
Mhm.
strictly like medical necessity to becoming a commodity that someone can
Exactly.
yeah.
make a money off of. And that's such a problem with not just, I mean, GLP-1s are an example of that, but like food as a whole is corporatized.
All this, talking about like food deserts and the example of like Serena and Oprah and this idea of like beauty standards being one very Eurocentric in
Yes.
general, right? Like they shift and they evolve over time. And there was a time in the early 2000s where curvy was in, right? And so then
Mhm.
everyone wanted like, the Beyonce butt or or the
Yeah.
J-Lo butt or the Kim Kardashian butt. Well, not the Kim Kardashian butt because her butt is fake.
I know.
But but like she modeled her butt after everyone else's butt, but in general, like if we look at historically, if we look at how beauty standards have been shaped, right? It's typically shaped in a way that accommodates white supremacy, that accommodates this like Eurocentric vision of like what, especially for women, right? For
Mhm.
what femininity is supposed to look like and for proper femininity that upholds white supremacist ideals. And so, in this conversation, like I can't help but think about like obviously access to nutrition and nutritious food is an issue for more than just one type of community. But I think I'm always thinking at the intersection of like how this affects like groups of people that have been historically marginalized, right? Like Black and Brown communities. Like when we think about like food deserts in urban areas, which shouldn't fucking exist. Like it's a
Mhm.
highly developed area to live in. Why is there no grocery store within a mile of someone's home? Like that should just
Exactly.
not be a thing. But then when we think like I'm thinking about places in Atlanta that were food deserts, and they were almost all Black and Brown communities
Mhm.
that had been like, redlined, right? That had been gerrymandered outside of like certain districts over time for voter suppression. And then there's lack of access to housing, lack of access to food. And so I know this is like your work, like your industry, like not just like something that you're passionate about. How do you handle that and address that in your work?
Oh gosh, I always talk about it because I think that it's so incredibly important because people forget or they don't realize even. And I remember even in my work, we were having a meeting, an internal meeting, and someone from the outside at a certain organization was presenting to us. And I'll never forget the presenter was saying, it was a great presentation, but we were talking about redlining and the grocery stores, being sometimes a disparity in certain neighborhoods. And the person presenting was even saying that they were shocked. They didn't realize that 99-cent stores were actually a thing, were actually existing because they didn't realize, they didn't realize this because they don't live in those neighborhoods. Because where do you normally see
Hmm.
like 99-cent stores? Right. And so it's always kind of astonishing to me that we sometimes just live in totally separate worlds with other people. And again, person had great intentions and not that their presentation wasn't great or that they weren't knowledgeable, but this goes to show you that even when you work in community health in, some place like, that's like the health department or something like that or some nonprofit organization, when you're going into certain communities, you don't actually most of the time a lot of people who go into those communities don't live there, don't reside there. So it's sort of a shock to the system, like, wait, I can't find a grocery store around here, or "Oh, I didn't realize 99-cent stores actually existed." It's like, of course they existed. Of course they exist because there are no grocery stores. So yes, like, the Dollar Tree actually is a store. It's not just a made up TikTok thing. It's actually a
Hmm.
store. So it's always really interesting to me. that perspective. And it just makes me realize that we need to keep talking about these things because oftentimes many people don't realize that these issues exist and they're systemic issues they're intentional, let's face it, because we're not our money is being, kind of used. I'm talking about money like as government, it's being used for other things. And there is a need, there's a need for healthcare, there's a need for accessible food, there's a need for housing, but we're spending it on all these other things. So it's hard to keep talking about it because I'm sure people are like, oh my God, this again. But I'm going to keep talking about it because I think it's necessary.
Well, I think it's really important. And you have a unique view into a lot of this that a lot of people, most of us don't, and understanding since you do work at that government level. And you mentioned at the beginning, like, I'm sure we'll get into the ways the government is a part of this because that's all. I mean, a lot of these conversations we're having about how things are political, it's both about the actual policies and the political
Hmm.
people who are responsible for those, and also like culturally and the way our systems reinforce those policies outside of the actual policies. But I would love to hear a little more about, like, I mean, obviously, I hinted at SNAP and that there are benefits that can
Yeah,
help people access food. There's some of these things like redlining, which I don't think is any longer an actual allowed policy, but it still happens. But what are some of the
hmm
government policies that contribute to the politics of food that affect who gets access and who doesn't and all of that?
for sure. SNAP, SNAP was a big one. SNAP educational programs, like, the program that I work for currently has definitely been affected because of the cuts to SNAP. So with the big beautiful bill, when it first came out, they were talking about how it's going to be restructured, right? SNAP is going to be restructured as far as who can benefit from it, who can still get their families on the program. And and in a way, and of course, all of this is just to save money, right? It always comes down to capitalism at the end of the day. It's unfortunately a lot of people, how they restructured things. Now, people that were maybe on disability, people that were of a certain age, now it's like you have to prove your worth to get access to food by finding some sort of job in order to qualify for SNAP, in order to qualify to get access to food. And the whole reason for SNAP is because those people could not work, right? Could not work the hours as someone who is able-bodied. So that was the whole point. And now that's being restructured. So we're going to see, and of course, we're not getting what is it called? Where we see like the food insecurity statistics that has been dismantled, which is no surprise because SNAP was cut off. So now, surprise, surprise, all of a sudden we're not getting the food insecurity statistics. So we're not seeing the trend in that. But we know that when someone isn't going to access food or not able to access food, obviously food insecurity is going to go up. And it had already been increasing before the government kind of shut down that funding for those studies. So we know that it's most likely going to be on the rise now. And so it's just it's just very hard. SNAP is definitely one big one where, again, food policies, the politics of food, who we decide to vote, and it's not just blaming one party because they're both parties, right? Unfortunately, we have a two-party system, and it's not just one side because unfortunately, people from, the Democratic side also decided that, you know what, let's go ahead with this big, beautiful bill. Because again, at the end of the day, it's all about money. And unfortunately, it's people who need access to food that are going to pay the price. Just like how the Obamacare, as people like to call it, or ACA, right? That is also or in talks of being restructured. So people are going to have their health care affected. So all of these, it's sort of like a trickle down, effect. But for sure, SNAP has been the biggest one, has been the biggest cut that we see. So it's very concerning. It's very concerning.
You're muted, Taina.
Sorry, I forgot I was on mute.
That's okay.
It kind of creates this it kind of creates this domino effect, right? Because food insecurity happens not because there's not enough food, but because of access to food. And then you take away people's access to food, create food insecurity, which creates health problems. And now all of a sudden people have less access to health care.
Mhm.
So it's like it's creating this world in which you're just setting up, you're scaffolding up ways for people to just die.
Yes.
Not to be
Yeah.
macabre, but, like, basically that's where we're headed, and, like,
Yeah.
how do you see, climate change affecting all of this? Because I know a lot of times the argument is like, well, because of
Mhm.
climate change, like, our food structures, our food systems are gonna change and, and our food some of our food is gonna be contaminated or not contaminated or GMOs, like, things like that having to, like, grow like, have lab-grown food because
Mhm.
of the land being, like, just unable to be used because of whatever reason. So, like, how does
Mhm.
that affect access to food and, like, what kind of
Yeah.
nutritious food we have available to us?
Yeah, and I'm going to say something very controversial here. Like I'm not actually not scared or I'm not against like lab grown foods, right? Because we do have we climate change is very much impactful. And we especially now, again, everything is political, where we're now seeing all of these pesticides being approved by our governments. We're seeing the EPA, like funding cut
Mhm.
for that. Like all of these things again are being affected, which affects our food. But also, I know like lab grown sounds very scary, but it it's really not because if we can find a way to mimic nutrition where it can make more foods accessible to people, I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it's necessarily I know the word sounds scary, like even GMO, right? Like genetically
Mm.
modified. There are only 11 crops that are currently GMO, so every single time I see a label on something that's like, I'm non-GMO, it's like, no, that's because we don't have GMO in your crop. But, I think that that's sort of where we're headed as far as trying to come up with ways to get food out to people to make it more accessible because we have more people now on this planet that need to be fed. So that looks like I know where was this? I don't know how long ago this was actually. So I might be wrong on timing, but this was like a few years ago where people were developing a certain rice, like a golden rice. I'm not sure if it was Japan or China, but again, like these lab grown GMO foods, but they developed a rice that was had more nutrients than your regular field grown rice.
Mm.
And that's a way to get more nutrition out to people. And so, like I said, it sounds scary, but again, when I think of processed foods and I think of like enriched foods or fortified foods, that's just adding vitamins and minerals to certain foods. It's in like a food system, right? We have to like when I look at the cereal I have on my counter now, I see a bunch of vitamins and minerals added to that. That occurred, in an industrial setting. And I don't think that's
Yeah.
necessarily a bad thing. Do I want people eating an abundance of sugar, an abundance of fats? No, I do not. But I do think that there is a way to make food more nutritious and we need to find a way to feed people. And we're running out of we're running out of land sources. So, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
You mentioned Europe as a standard, the gold standard. You could, get into all of the colonizing white supremacist reasons that that's probably the case, both in perception and maybe in reality. But I'm just curious for you, as you think about things like quality of food, access to food, policies around food, what is your gold standard? Like, what would be your dream? We can't change the reality of how many people are on Earth, but if we
Right.
could make some policies and that would access and quality, like what would you like the food system and our thoughts around nutrition to look like?
I mean, in an ideal world, I would love for something, like farmers markets. I would love that to not just be, I don't know what farmers markets are like in other places, but in New York, they're like twice a week, and you have to like and they cost a bunch of money. I'm talking about the food, the things that are sold, for obvious reasons, right? It's a ton of work that that, is put into farming and all of that. But in an ideal world, it would be great to have more of those types of markets in many places throughout the week that are so it's accessible. It's currently for myself to get to the nearest farmers market where I live, it's definitely more than a mile. It's only on Saturdays, so it's a bit of a trek. And, it would be nice if I could do that more often and if the prices would be lower, thinking of people that, can afford that. I because when I read online where people are talking about, oh my God, grocery store bills are increasing, someone will always say in the comments, just grow your own food. How are you growing your own food when you live in a high rise, high rise with all these other buildings? It's just not realistic. And so that's why it would be great to be able to, have more of those types of markets around to buy, that seasonal produce around.
Yeah.
That would be great in an ideal world. But again,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's
And
not
even if you
it's
like,
not
we have a
realistic
backyard and we
with the amount of people we
it's not
have
possible for
or with the
everyone.
cost. Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Even if you do have the land to grow your own food, like if you have mobility issues, that makes it harder. It's not always just a matter of like access to land. I did want to highlight, Becky, before you ask your question, there's a school, a private school. It's a community school. So when I say private, I don't mean like rich. It's in an urban setting in Atlanta, and they have some land and they teach the kids to grow the food, and then the families can partake of the food that's grown there, of the produce that's grown there. And I think that's a really exceptional model for like how a community can like build together a sustainable source of food within its own like parameters.
Well, community gardens are amazing,
Yeah.
and where available, where there's land, where there's all of the things that go into it, they're amazing when that works. And that is part of the dream deal world would be that we could have more communal experiences of food and collective experience of growing and sharing. And I just wanted to mention too on that ideal vision, it's like when it comes to the farmers markets and community gardens and things like that, our government is subsidizing like corn. They're subsidizing crops that often end up destroyed
Yeah.
versus subsidizing all farmers, right? There's corporate subsidies that go to very large farmers. Most of our farming now is factory farming. It's large corporatized farming. And the small farmer it hardly exists anymore. And where they do, they're struggling because most of them, most often, are not getting access to those subsidies because there's not subsidies for small crops of tomatoes,
Hmm.
of lettuce. And that is a big part of the problem too. So yeah, it's just like thinking about how our money is being
Yeah.
used. Right. Yeah. So anyway, that's all I wanted to add to that.
Yeah. Much
Um,
of eating and food is supposed to be communal. Like whenever I talk about food, like I talk about so many different topics, but I always say like food represents many things. And I think community and a shared joy is one of them. Like whenever you look at old pictures of back in the day, I'm talking like Victorian times, like you see a table with food around it, the whole concept of breaking bread, right? It was like that's how people got together and gathered. It was around food. And I think that, unfortunately, we've come to a place now where people are now scared to eat certain foods, when we're going back to diet culture, we're just in a place where everyone's so scared. And I see articles about, I forget well, I would never call them out anyway, but I definitely read an article where they were talking about how women are more likely when they meet up with their friends to go out to brunch, and they were like, well, to help you lose weight, maybe just consider going to an exercise class with your girlfriends instead. And I'm like, what in the diet culture? I was like, no, I mean, yes, I would. I mean, yeah, I would. Sure, we'll work out. But afterwards, we're doing something else. Like, what are you talking about? So I just think that we forget that like so much of community is centered around food. And even the concept of community gardens, right? That's how we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be a communal, thriving society. And unfortunately, we're very individualistic. Made me think of that very problematic article I saw.
Yes. Last question here. We covered a lot, like, but what is like the one thing that for someone who's, watching this on YouTube or listening to this on their drive in or from work or wherever, what's the one thing you want people to keep thinking about when it comes to like nutrition and food and how the politics of all of that?
I would say that always to remember that food and how you eat is always going to be individual. And individual meaning, of course, what works for your body as far as certain foods. Even if you're not allergic to something, maybe some foods don't make you feel great. So definitely don't eat them, but individual as far as also how you access food. Because I think that, I talk about a lot of things, but I will always talk about processed foods / convenience foods because I don't want people to feel shamed when they have to use something that comes from a can, right? Because
Hmm.
we're told fresh is best. Not always, or they have to use something from a package or that's frozen. And I want people to remember that how we eat is going to be individual because of our finances, because of our accessibility. Like for some people, they can't chop because they have fine motor skill issues. So they're going to purchase pre-cut vegetables, pre-cut onions. And I don't want someone to feel ashamed of that because that's how you're going to nourish your body. That's great. And I just want people to remember that food is individual. Yeah.
That's what you do such a good job on social media of showing up when people start saying like, who would spend this much money on diced
There's a
tomatoes or
reason it
whatever.
exists. Yeah.
Exactly. And that reminder and advocating for those voices. So thank you. And I guess actually there's one more question, which is if there's one resource, one book maybe that people could read don't have your education around nutrition. So I'm talking lay people books for the rest of us who want to learn a little more about this. Like what's one book that need to open your eyes in some way around some aspect of diet culture, food policy?
Mine is out there. I would always say mine. As far as learning more about diet culture, I mean, there's so many different ones to consider. My first introduction, which I thought was so helpful, was Christy Harrison's Anti-Diet. I think that it's really helpful because she breaks down again the history of diet culture. So if anyone's really fascinated in that aspect, that would also be a really great resource to have. Excuse me. I always think Sabrina String's Fearing the Black Body is also incredibly important. It's like a must have as well. That really goes into how, as far as like how white supremacy had a huge impact on how we view our bodies as a whole, as society. So that is also a really great resource. And I will also add, I have a friend, right, Chrissy King. I know many people have have heard of her, but the Body Liberation Project is also such a great read and book. If you are tired of the diet culture noise, I think that's also a really great resource to have on the shelf. Yeah.
I love Missy. And I have Sabrina's book as well, Sabrina Strings. It's a little denser, meaning like a little more academic, but definitely
For
worth reading.
sure. For sure. Yeah.
But thank you so much for this, Shauna. I really appreciate you being here and being a part of this. And we'll link to your book and your social media in the show notes so people can go read your book. And then also definitely follow the Nutrition Tea because you bring it and it's amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Messy Liberation.
Will you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen?
Taking that moment to do that will really help us reach a wider audience.
Thank you so much for your support and for listening today.
Until next time.